He was driving late at night, alone on the deserted road. Suddenly, he saw a woman walking on the roadside, barefoot, her face pale and covered in blood. He stopped to help her. But what happened next would change his life forever. Have you ever had that feeling that you've made the wrong decision, but you can't take it back? This is the story of Lucas, an ordinary man who made a split-second decision and ended up living the most terrifying and life-changing moment of his life. Get ready, because this isn't just a story, it's a warning. Lucas was the kind of person who liked to plan everything down to the smallest detail. He didn't believe in coincidences and preferred to avoid situations that took him out of his comfort zone. But that night, nothing went according to plan. The visit to his mother, who was in a critical condition in hospital, had been exhausting. He felt the weight of worry and helplessness. The long journey home was the last thing he wanted to face, but the thought of sleeping on the hospital's uncomfortable sofa pushed him onto the road. The clock struck almost midnight, and the highway was a desert. Only the sound of his car's engine and the muffled rumble of the tires on the asphalt filled the silence. He accelerated more than usual, anxious to get home. But just as he passed a sharp bend, something broke the monotony. He saw a figure on the side of the road, barely illuminated by the headlights. For a moment, he thought his mind was playing tricks, the result of extreme tiredness. But when he looked in the rearview mirror, the figure was still there. Lucas hesitated. It was too late to find someone walking on the roadside, especially on such an isolated stretch. He thought about moving on. It's none of my business, he tried to convince himself. But something inside him, a mixture of curiosity and compassion, made him break. With the car at a standstill, he looked in the rearview mirror again. The figure looked feminine, with dirty, disheveled clothes. Lucas swallowed before opening the window. "Are you all right? Do you need any help?" His voice came out steady, but his heart was racing. The woman took a few steps towards the car. When he finally saw her up close, Lucas felt a shiver run up his spine. She was barefoot, with deep cuts on her legs and arms, and her pale, almost translucent face seemed marked by suffering that went beyond the physical. She didn't respond immediately. She just looked at him, as if assessing whether she could trust him. Lucas tried again. "You're hurt. Get in the car. I'm taking you to a hospital." This time she obeyed, but not without first casting a furtive glance at the darkness behind her, as if she were running away from something. As soon as she got into the car, the atmosphere seemed to change. The silence became heavier, more oppressive. Lucas tried to ease the tension with casual conversation. "What happened? Was there an accident?" But the woman remained silent, staring at the dashboard. He noticed that her hands were shaking, and the expression on her face was one of sheer terror. After a few minutes, she finally spoke, but what she said made him even more uneasy. "They're coming." Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but full of urgency. "Who's coming?" Lucas asked, trying to remain calm. She didn't answer. Instead, she pressed her wounded arm against her body and began to mumble something inaudible. Lucas glanced quickly in the rearview mirror. The road was still empty, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. He didn't know if she was in shock or if there was something else going on. His mind began to run through scenarios. Perhaps she was the victim of a crime. Perhaps she was on the run from someone dangerous. But there was something about the situation that didn't fit. Her words, although vague, seemed to carry a dark meaning. The tension in the car increased with every kilometer. Lucas felt the cold sweat on his forehead as he struggled to keep his focus on the road. He tried to reassure her. "Everything's fine. We're almost at the hospital. You'll be safe there." But on hearing this, the woman turned to him with a desperate look on her face. "Don't go away after leaving me there," she begged, with an intensity that made Lucas' heart race. Before he could reply, she looked back at the window, muttering again. Lucas swallowed. He wanted to believe that he was doing the right thing, but that feeling that something was deeply wrong was undeniable. The hospital was his only option. He accelerated, wishing that the journey would end soon, unaware that the real nightmare had only just begun. When Lucas finally saw the lights of the hospital in the distance, he felt a brief sense of relief. The woman next to him, however, seemed more tense than ever. She was now gripping the armrest of the seat so tightly that her fingers were pale, and her gaze was fixed on the road as if she expected something to appear out of nowhere. Lucas noticed that she was breathing irregularly, and her low murmur continued, but the words made no sense to him. "We're here. You'll be safe now," he said as he turned into the hospital entrance. He parked next to the emergency room, opened the door, and tried to help the woman out of the car. She hesitated, as if an invisible force was preventing her from moving forward. Lucas insisted, "Come on, the doctors can take care of your injuries." The woman looked at him with wide, almost desperate eyes. "Promise me you won't leave me alone," she begged, holding Lucas' arm tighter than he expected from someone so fragile. "If you leave, they'll find me." The intensity in her voice shook him. He didn't know who they were, but something about it seemed genuine, a mixture of fear and conviction that made him shake his head in confirmation. "I promise. But first you need help," he replied, carefully guiding her into the hospital. As they entered, the bright, sterile environment seemed a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness of the road. A nurse rushed to attend to them, and Lucas quickly explained what had happened. The woman was placed in a wheelchair and taken to an examination room. Lucas stood in the corridor, feeling a strange mixture of relief and unease. He thought about leaving. After all, his part was done. But the promise he had made echoed in his mind, and something in him couldn't let go of that woman. He went to the reception desk and asked if he could check on her. The receptionist, with a protocol smile, replied that he would have to wait. Lucas sat down in one of the uncomfortable chairs in the waiting room, running his fingers through his hair in a nervous gesture. He tried to call home, but the phone had no signal, something unusual in that area. He looked around, and for the first time realized that the hospital was strangely empty for that time of night. As he waited, something began to bother him. The woman's words, "They're coming," kept running through his head. He tried to rationalize, telling himself that she was probably in shock or delirious. But there was something about that road that night that didn't seem right. After about 20 minutes, a doctor appeared in the corridor. Lucas stood up immediately. "How is she? Is she going to be okay?" The doctor paused, somewhat hesitantly, before answering, "Physically, she's stable. The injuries aren't serious, but she seems very traumatized. She's in a state of shock and repeats disconnected things about being chased." Lucas felt a chill when he heard that. "Did she mention who's after her?" he asked, trying to hide his anxiety. The doctor shook her head. "No, but she insists she's not safe. We'll keep her under observation and seek psychiatric support." Before Lucas could reply, the sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor. It was a policeman, accompanied by another nurse. "Are you Lucas, the man who brought the woman in?" he asked, his tone leaving no room for evasion. Lucas confirmed this, somewhat confused. "What's going on?" he asked, sensing that the situation was getting out of hand. The policeman exchanged a serious look with the nurse before replying, "We received a call about an incident in the area where you found her. A vehicle has been abandoned with signs of a struggle. We want to know exactly what you saw." Lucas began to explain what he remembered, but as he spoke, he noticed that something was wrong. The light in the corridor began to flicker, and the nurse looked around, visibly uncomfortable. "Does this happen all the time?" asked Lucas, trying to ease the tension. "No," she replied dryly. The policeman frowned, looking up at the ceiling. Suddenly, a metallic noise resounded from somewhere far away in the hospital, as if something heavy had fallen. Lucas felt his panic rise again. He realized that the woman was right about one thing. Something or someone was chasing her. And now he was involved too. The metallic sound echoed again, this time closer, interrupting any attempt at reasoning by Lucas. He looked at the policeman, expecting an answer or immediate action, but the man seemed as bewildered as he was. The nurse, visibly frightened, held the clipboard against her chest as if it would protect her from something invisible. "This isn't normal," she muttered, almost to herself, before slowly walking away towards the counter. Lucas tried to ignore the feeling that something bigger was about to happen. He turned to the policeman. "You need to tell me what's going on. Who is after her? And why is this involving me now?" The policeman hesitated, but before he could answer, the lights in the corridor began to flicker again, this time with greater intensity, plunging the hospital into brief periods of total darkness. In the midst of the intermittent darkness, Lucas heard something, a low whisper, almost as if the very air around him was hissing. It wasn't coming from a specific direction, but it seemed to be everywhere, enveloping them in a suffocating tension. He felt cold sweat trickle down the back of his neck and realized he wasn't the only one. The nurse was moving faster now, pressing buttons on the counter, as if looking for an emergency protocol that simply didn't exist. "Come with me," the policeman said suddenly, grabbing Lucas's arm and pulling him towards the corridor that led to the rooms. The man's sudden change of attitude was alarming, but Lucas didn't protest. He just followed, his footsteps echoing on the shiny floor as he tried to shake off the growing panic. As they passed a series of closed doors, the policeman explained in a low, urgent voice, "The woman, she may be involved in something very dangerous. We don't have all the details, but people have disappeared in that same area where you found her. Abandoned cars, signs of a struggle, and no explanation." Lucas felt his breathing quicken. He was starting to connect the dots, but the picture that was forming was so absurd that he couldn't believe it. "Are you saying that she's the cause of this? Or are you running away from it?" he asked, but before the policeman could answer, a scream cut through the air like a knife. They both stopped instantly. The scream came from the room where the woman had been taken. Without thinking, Lucas ran towards the sound, ignoring the policeman's protests. As he entered the room, the scene before him was like something out of a nightmare. The woman was standing in the center of the room, completely motionless, her eyes fixed on nothing. All around her, medical equipment was flashing and beeping irregularly, as if an invisible force was interfering. "Hey," Lucas called out, trying to get closer, but stopped when she finally turned to him. Her eyes were different now, no longer desperate, but empty, as if something had taken their place. She raised her hand, as if to say something, but before she could make a sound, the windows of the room exploded, filling the air with shards of glass and an icy wind that shouldn't have been there. The policeman appeared behind Lucas, gun in hand, but the woman stepped forward, completely ignoring the chaotic situation around her. "I can't run away any longer," she said, her voice calm but loaded with a resignation that made Lucas' heart squeeze. "They're here." At that moment, Lucas felt something he couldn't describe, presence. It wasn't something he saw or heard, but something he felt, like a shadow that couldn't be perceived by the eyes. The policeman took a step back, his hand visibly shaking as he cocked his gun. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted, but no one had an answer. The woman looked directly at Lucas, as if he were the only person in the room capable of understanding. "I tried to warn you. You shouldn't have stopped on that road," she said, her voice filled with a sadness that Lucas would never forget. He wanted to shout that it didn't make sense, that it was all a big mistake, but the words died in his throat as the icy wind intensified and something that wasn't human, began to take shape in the room. It was a dark, amorphous presence, but impossible to ignore. Lucas felt as if gravity itself had changed, pulling him closer to that entity that seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. The woman began to back away, her eyes finally filled with panic again as the presence drew closer. "You need to get out of here," she shouted at Lucas, but he was paralyzed. Something inside him knew that, even if he ran, he would never escape. This wasn't just about her. Somehow he was involved now, and there was no turning back. Lucas felt the pressure around him increase, as if the air in the room was being drained, replaced by something dense and oppressive. The amorphous figure in front of them pulsed, its presence defying all the laws of logic. He wanted to run, but it was as if his feet were glued to the floor. The woman, still backing away, looked directly at him, now desperate. You don't understand. This didn't start with me. I was just the next in line, and now you are too." Those words cut Lucas like a blade. He realized that she wasn't the cause, but a victim, just as he was about to be. It was a cycle, something ancient and inexorable, that trapped those who, by chance or fate, crossed its path. Lucas felt the truth weigh on him. Stopping on that road that night was no coincidence. Something or someone had put him there. But then something unexpected happened. The woman stepped forward, placing herself between Lucas and the entity. Her eyes, once full of emptiness, now shone with a determination that seemed almost supernatural. "This has to end here," she said, her voice carrying a strength that made even the presence flinch. Lucas tried to protest, but before he could say anything, the woman raised her hands in a gesture of surrender. The entity, as if it understood what was happening, began to approach her, leaving Lucas behind. The icy wind increased, and the surrounding environment seemed to distort, as if reality itself was being torn apart. Then, in an instant that was almost impossible to process, everything stopped. The sound, the wind, the pressure, everything disappeared. When Lucas opened his eyes, the room was empty. The woman, the entity, the chaos, everything was gone, as if it had never been there. Only the shards of glass and the damaged medical equipment bore witness to what had happened. The policeman rushed into the room, his face a mixture of shock and relief when he saw Lucas still standing. Where did she go?" he asked, but Lucas didn't have an answer. He just shook his head, feeling a mixture of relief and incomprehensible sadness. As he left the hospital that morning, Lucas knew that his life would never be the same. He carried not only the memory of that night, but also a sense of responsibility, as if the woman's story was now his to protect and perhaps unravel. He looked up at the still darkening sky and promised himself that he would not let that sacrifice be in vain. On the road home, every kilometer seemed a reminder of human frailty in the face of the unknown. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: something changed that night. And he would never forget the face of the woman who faced the impossible to save him. Just for those of you who like a good story and have watched to the end, leave your comment below from which city you're watching, and I'll leave a heart in your comment. Bye, and see you in the next video.